destruction of Ukraine.
Philip Dunn.
Thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to follow my right honourable friend, the member for Malden, who is a great expert on Ukraine in this place. In fact, the only time I visited Ukraine was when we went to Kiev together over a decade ago now, I regret to say. This is the first time I've spoken in a debate on Russian grand strategy, so I don't have the pedigree that most of the other speakers, certainly on this side of the House, have had in speaking today. There is a reason for that, and I'm just going to very briefly, before I get on to my main remarks, point to where I think this House has had some responsibility for allowing Russia under Putin to develop its strategy. And that goes back to a point that was made by my honourable friend, the member for Harwich and North Essex, for whom I should have started by congratulating on securing this debate. Nobody knows more about strategy and the absence of strategy in this country than he does, and he's doing a lot of work to try to put that right. But he referred to the vote in this House in 2013, which I participated in, and to the great shame of this House and this country, we decided not to take action when Assad used chemical weapons on his own people in Syria. And that vote, I believe, led to Obama deciding although the red line, which has been talked about, had been crossed on that occasion, it wasn't appropriate for the Americans to go it alone in taking action. And I think that was the trigger which allowed, one of the many triggers, but one of the most important ones, which allowed Putin then to take the action that he did in 2014 by invading Crimea and the Donbass, from which the subsequent invasion has flowed. And it was following that invasion in 2015 that the EU decided to take sanctions on, I think it was 89 Russian officials. And in response to that, Putin imposed sanctions on 89 officials in the European Union, of which I was one. I think I'm the only member of this House remaining who was sanctioned by Russia in 2015. And I've chosen not to speak in Russian debates, actually for that reason, because I didn't want to highlight the fact and felt it was not the right thing to do. Since then, of course, since this latest action, almost every member of this House has been sanctioned. It's no longer quite the badge of honour that it once was. And therefore, I'm no longer, I feel in good company, and I'm very grateful to Mr. Putin for making me feel slightly less lonely. I want to focus most of my remarks on what we can do as a nation at this stage. But before I do so, I do think it's worth just building on what was said by other members and honourable members about this totally bogus narrative that has been used, which my honourable friend, member for right honourable friend from Malden used, in the way in which Putin has created this narrative, not just for domestic consumption, although that, of course, is probably the primary objective, but also internationally. He has used this narrative of wanting to restore Russia to its rightful historic place as one of the great powers by undoing the damage from the collapse of the Soviet Union in order to win diplomatic support internationally. And he's done it in a very subtle way over a long period of time. And I would point to the establishment of Russia joining OPEC to form OPEC Plus in 2016 as a pivotal moment, because one of the things that we have seen so effectively with Russia's use of its oil and gas position and wealth is it's not only funded its war effort, but it has also worked within international fora to frustrate attempts by, in particular, the United States, but also the United Kingdom, to encourage other OPEC members to respond to the energy crisis caused by Putin's invasion of Ukraine to increase production. Russia persuaded them to do the reverse and to decrease production, thereby keeping up the oil price and helping fund his war effort. And that was an effective mechanism that he deployed, using this status of the victim and NATO being the aggressor and the bogus narrative that others have spoken of. And I think that has been a critical step, and it's really important that we in leading international efforts to help Ukraine, work across international fora with our friends in the Gulf to point out to them that Russia isn't their friend. They may have been somewhat disturbed by the West's approach, in particular the American oscillation over their relationships as they pivot to Asia about their protection for Gulf states. But the Gulf states are fearful most of all of the threat from Iran. Iran has demonstrated very, very graphically through their support for Russia and provision of military capability to Russia, which has been deployed effectively in Ukraine, that they are no friend of the Gulf. They are friends with Russia, and other nations need to come together with traditional Western allies who are their real friends. So I'd just like to focus my few remaining remarks on what we can do as a nation right now. And I would draw the attention of the House and the Minister on the bench to the refresh of the integrated review, which others, and notably the Chairman of the Defence Select Committee in a powerful contribution, have already raised this evening. This is an opportunity to try and reflect on the new strategic reality. I was involved in the Strategic Defence and Security Review in 2015. We've had the integrated review of 2021, and in neither case was war in Europe an active reality when those reviews were done. And we need now to recognise that the peace dividend that we as a nation and other Western nations have banked in the 1990s is no longer available. It's left our defence forces with funding for a peacetime environment. We are no longer in a peacetime environment. We are in a war environment. Yeah. We need to recognise this through this refresh, and it is therefore very timely that this opportunity has arisen, and partly in response to what's happening across the other side of Europe at the moment. Now, a year ago, the Defence Secretary secured a record increase in the defence budget, and the Minister on the bench was a Minister in the MOD at the time, and I'm sure made a powerful contribution to that. So £24 billion, as we hear across the floor, across the dispatch box, is a very welcome addition to the budget. But it is fast being eroded by inflation, and it is not leading to increases in capability in the here and now, as so often in defence budgets over a spending review period, as I and my honourable friend the member for Raleigh know all too well. These things tend to be backloaded. We can't afford to backload and restore capability in 5 or 10 years' time. We need it now, and our armed forces need to have the confidence to be able to go out and rebuild hollowed-out capability.
Well, my honourable friend allow me.
I will.
He's making a very good speech. As you will recall, we served together as ministers in the Ministry of Defence. And can I just completely commend his call for a sense of urgency in these matters. He was a procurement minister. He knows how long it takes to build this stuff. We're running out of time. So can I absolutely endorse the powerful point that he's just made?
I'm very grateful, and I'm well aware that my honourable friend, who, when we were in post, was responsible for personnel primarily, and then became Armed Forces Minister. But he's taken a particular interest in procurement of late, and I haven't always agreed with everything that he's said. But I think we are absolutely as one this evening on this issue. So, what should we be looking at in the refresh of the integrated review to deliver the strategic shift that I think is needed in the UK military capability? Well, the first thing that must be done is an immediate restoration of the manpower cuts in the British Army. It's very clear from what's happening in Ukraine that this is a land conflict. Our land capability in the British Army has for years suffered from cuts in capability, or in particular perhaps a lower prioritisation when it came to allocating funds for new capability. It takes, and this was largely because it's easier to cut a small programme, either to defer it for a bit or cut a bit out of it, than it is a major programme which takes years longer to achieve, which is typically the case in the air and the maritime domains. So we need to prioritise land capability refresh in this as well from an equipment perspective. So I think the second thing that the refresh needs to do is to look at the capability and the capital equipment required for the British Army. And again, the chairman of the Select Committee listed a number of items that he would like to see restored or improved. We need to learn the clear lessons from what current conflict is delivering from the state-on-state aggressor in the Ukraine. Now, I don't have a military background. I haven't studied the doctrine that the minister on the front bench, on the Treasury bench, has done. But it's very clear that to take territory in a modern battlefield requires the ability to manoeuvre at scale and to do so under armoured protection. So our both infantry mobility and our power projection on land at scale is vital to be restored. We've heard that much of our equipment is now decades old, although some of it remains more effective and capable than an anniversary might have. We just don't have enough of it, and it's getting pretty tired. We also need to be able to clear territory in advance. So we need to have artillery capability and agile UAVs which are capable of delivering force across a battlefield. Air protection is critical for this, and so we need air defence and a variety of UAVs. Much of our UAV capability has been built around delivering precision fire remotely, which has been very effective in theatres where we've been operating, such as Afghanistan or Iraq, but would be much harder to deliver at scale across a wider battlefront. And for any new capability with new manpower, more manpower and capability and equipment, this cannot be effective unless we have the manpower trained to use it. So the integrated review also needs to provide adequate funding to allow force-on-force armoured training at scale and to be able to have access to training areas to be able to do so and to experiment with novel groupings and battle groups at scale. We are in danger of giving up the capability that we've had, I think in particular of the training ground in Canada. Now, in order to do this, we need agile procurement. As some of us, in fact, I called for in a paper which was written in 2018, and which is being provided through urgent operational requirements, as has been mentioned, and by the individual commands through their rapid capability offices that have been established and are doing very well at bringing in new capability, often procured off the shelf, but typically at small scale. And what we're talking about here is something different to small scale. So I think we do need to consider acquiring some capability off the shelf and not. We don't have the luxury of a 10-year procurement programme, which in itself may slip, as we've heard before, and is been discussed often in this chamber. So that is something that I think we've got to contemplate, even if it means we don't necessarily buy British all the time. We can continue to provide the Ukraine with equipment, and we've shown the lead in Europe in doing so, which I commend the government for the stance that it's taken, and also in training the brave Ukrainian soldiers how to use this equipment. But this conflict is going on longer, certainly than the aggressor intended, longer than any of us would like to see. But we must plan to assume that it will continue for some time and supplies will be needed for some time. So we have, in the integrated review, to be prepared to backfill our own supplies of munitions and increase our own stockpiles and our capability. And this takes time, it takes treasure. And we need to establish strategic reserves as a result of the integrated review, which will allow us to sustain our own forces and those in Ukraine for a long time. In conclusion, Mr Deputy Speaker, we have to demonstrate to the Russians that the UK has the resolve to stand fast behind Ukraine, and we have the resolve to make sure that NATO is in a position to act as a deterrent to any extension of this conflict beyond where it currently is.
Spokesman Dave Dougan.
Mr Deputy Speaker, and thank you as well to the Right Honourable Member for Harrop